Hey, so glad you got here. We were totally waiting for you, just about to listen to a story about a forgotten northern road, a weathered bard, and the kind of song that seems to have been hiding under the snow, patiently waiting for someone stubborn enough to find it. Tonight, you can imagine the crackling warmth of a quiet evening, the sound of distant winds, and the feeling of settling into a tale where old legends stretch their hands toward the stars. And yes, somewhere out there, a very serious old musician is probably arguing with a stubborn goose or a badly tuned harp, because even legendary adventures need a little comedy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what hour it is where you are. It is always wonderful to know how far these old tales travel. Now settle in, get comfortable, and just relax. Today's tale starts like this. In the far northern reaches, where forests stood like silent armies and mountains wore crowns of white. Throughout much of the year, there lived a man named Eric, who carried more memories than possessions. He was a bard, though not the kind who chased golden halls or begged kings for a place beside their feasts. Those days had passed. His cloak had faded, his boots had traveled too many roads, and his hands had learned the shape of his old wooden harp so well that he could almost play it while half asleep. Almost. The harp did not always agree with him. There were mornings when Eirik would pluck a string, and the instrument would answer with a sound so strange that even the nearby birds seemed to pause and wonder if they should leave the region entirely. A bard and his harp, after all, were supposed to create harmony. Erik's harp occasionally preferred to create a discussion, but despite its stubborn nature, the instrument had carried him across countless valleys and villages. It had heard the laughter of children, the whispers of nobles, the songs of soldiers, and the quiet stories told by farmers after long days beneath the northern sky. Eirik had spent his life collecting these moments. Yet as the years passed, one thought began returning to him again and again. There was one song he had never finished. It was not his most famous song, though many believed it was. It was not the melody that had made people remember his name, nor the ballad that travelers repeated beside their fires. No, the unfinished song was something older, something deeper. A melody that had followed him since his youth. Eirik first discovered its beginning when he was a young traveler with more confidence than wisdom, which was a dangerous combination for any person carrying a musical instrument. He had believed every road existed simply to lead him toward greatness. The world, however, had a habit of gently reminding young dreamers that mountains do not move aside because someone arrives with a song and a dramatic expression. He had wandered through northern villages, learning local tunes and ancient stories. He listened to fishermen who remembered storms from decades before, shepherds who knew the names of distant hills, and elders who carried family legends older than many castles. Among those stories, he heard whispers of an ancient melody known as the Northern Song. People said it had once united clans separated by mountains and rivalries. They said it carried the voices of kings, travelers, and ordinary people who had lived beneath the same endless sky. Most laughed when they heard such tales, and perhaps they had reason to. Northern villagers were famous for making simple events sound enormous. A lost sheep could become a legendary creature after enough people sat around a fire and added their own details. One person would say the sheep was clever. Another would claim it had escaped a wolf. A third would insist the sheep had looked directly into a warrior's eyes and judged him. By the end of the evening, the sheep was practically expected to become ruler of the valley. But Eirik believed there was truth hidden beneath the exaggerations. He spent many years searching for fragments of the Northern Song. He collected verses, melodies, and stories from places where snow covered ancient paths. He learned that one strange curiosity of northern traditions was that many communities remembered history through songs rather than written records. A melody could preserve a family's memory for generations, passing from one voice to another like a treasured piece of silver. Eventually, Eric created his own version of the legendary song. People loved it. They gathered to hear him perform. They repeated his verses while traveling. Some even claimed that when Eric sang, the wind itself seemed to slow down to listen. Eric always smiled at that part. He knew the wind was probably just passing through and had no special interest in becoming a music critic. Still, the praise meant little compared to the missing piece that remained in his heart. The final verse, the ending, the part that would complete the song he had carried for most of his life. Now, as an older man, Eric lived quietly in a northern village surrounded by familiar forests. Each evening, he sat beneath the open sky and searched his memories for the words that had escaped him. He remembered the beginning. He remembered the middle. But the ending remained hidden. It felt as if the song itself was waiting for something. Not a better voice, not a stronger musician, not a younger man. Something else. One evening, as the first frost covered the ground and the stars appeared above the dark horizon, Eric placed his harp beside him and looked toward the distant mountains. He understood something he had avoided for many years. The final verse was not somewhere behind him. It was somewhere ahead. The old bard packed his few belongings, wrapped his harp carefully, and prepared to leave the only home he had known for many seasons. The journey would be difficult, the roads would be cold, the mountains would be unforgiving, and his knees, which had once carried him across kingdoms, would certainly have several complaints about this decision. But Eric had spent his whole life following songs, and now, for the first time, he would follow one that had been waiting for him. Eric had always believed that every song had a birthplace. Some were born beside rivers, where the sound of flowing water mixed with the voices of travelers. Some were born in crowded marketplaces, where merchants, craftsmen, and wandering musicians exchanged stories as easily as they exchanged goods. Others were born in moments of silence, when a person sat alone beneath the sky and finally heard the thoughts they had been avoiding. The northern song, however, seemed to have been born everywhere. That was what fascinated Eric when he was young. The melody appeared in fragments across the northern lands, hidden inside different traditions, and carried by people who often did not realize they were holding a piece of something much older. His first encounter with the song happened many years earlier, when he was barely more than a boy with a borrowed cloak, a small harp, and a level of confidence that was impressive, considering how little experience he actually possessed. Young Eric believed he understood the world. He believed songs were treasures waiting to be collected. He believed every village contained a secret melody, every old traveler had a forgotten tale, and every mountain path was simply an invitation. The mountains, naturally, disagreed. They did not care about his dreams. They did not care about his excitement. They simply stood there, enormous and cold, reminding him that nature had been ancient long before any bard decided to write a dramatic song about it. His first years as a wandering musician were not exactly glorious. There were evenings when he performed for small gatherings and received only a few coins. There were mornings when he woke up with frozen boots and wondered if becoming a legendary bard had perhaps been slightly oversold as a profession. Nobody ever mentioned the uncomfortable parts in the old tales. They always spoke of heroes standing proudly beneath the moonlight. They rarely mentioned heroes trying to dry their socks over a weak fire while wondering if their dinner was actually edible. But Eric continued. He listened. That was his greatest gift. Many musicians wanted to be heard. Eric wanted to understand. When he entered a village, he did not immediately take out his harp. He sat beside fishermen, repairing their nets. He walked with farmers returning from their fields. He shared meals with travelers and listened as they spoke about places he had never seen. he discovered that ordinary people carried extraordinary memories. An old woman might remember a song her grandmother taught her when she was a child. A shepherd might know a melody used by generations of families while guiding animals through the northern valleys. A warrior might quietly hum a tune that reminded him of a home he had not visited in decades. Eirik collected these pieces. Slowly, a pattern appeared. Different regions had different versions, but certain notes remained the same. Certain words returned. Certain images appeared again and again. Snow falling on empty fields, a river beneath the stars, a lonely traveler searching for a place that no longer existed. The more Eirik learned, the more he became convinced that these were fragments of the same ancient song. One winter evening, while staying in a small settlement near the northern forests, he met an elderly storyteller named Halvor. Halvor was the kind of man who looked as though he had personally argued with every storm that ever crossed the land and somehow won. His beard was enormous. His voice was rough. His walking stick appeared to have survived more battles than some warriors. When Eirik asked him about the northern song, Halvor became quiet. Most people laughed at the question. They told Eirik it was only a legend. Halvor did not laugh. Instead, he invited the young bard to sit near the fire and told him an old tale. According to Halvor, the northern song had once belonged to a bard who served no single ruler. This bard traveled between kingdoms during a time of conflict and carried messages between people who refused to speak to one another. The song was not powerful because it was beautiful. It was powerful because it reminded people that enemies could still share memories. Halvor explained that the final verse was lost because it contained the most important message of all. Not a victory, not a treasure, not a prophecy, a truth. But Halvor did not know what that truth was. Nobody did. That night, Eirik barely slept. The idea followed him like a shadow. A song without its ending. A story without its final meaning. From that moment onward, the northern song became more than a melody. It became his companion. Years passed. Eirik grew older. His travels expanded. His reputation grew. People began calling him the voice of the Frostlands because his songs seemed to carry the feeling of the northern wilderness. He performed in great halls and humble homes. He sang for nobles dressed in fine clothing and villagers wearing simple wool garments. He discovered that a song could travel farther than a person ever could. A person needed roads. A song needed only a voice. Yet despite all his success, Eirik never forgot Halvor's words. The final verse remained missing, and as the years passed, the unfinished song became heavier. It was not an unpleasant burden. No, it was more like a locked door that he could see every day but could never open. Now, decades after that first discovery, Eirik stood at the edge of another road. His hair was silver, his hands were slower, his footsteps were careful. But the same curiosity that guided the young musician still lived inside him. He carried the old harp. He carried his memories. And he carried the hope that somewhere beyond the northern valleys, the missing piece of the song was waiting. The morning he departed, the villagers gathered to say farewell. Some wished him luck. Some questioned whether a man his age should really be climbing frozen mountain paths in search of a forgotten verse. Eirik simply smiled. He had heard worse advice. After all, people had been telling him to stop chasing impossible songs for most of his life. And so far, it had worked out reasonably well. He stepped onto the northern road as the wind moved through the trees. The journey had begun, and somewhere beyond the frost-covered valleys, the forgotten melody was waiting. The Forgotten King's Melody. The road northward was not a road in the way. Many people imagined roads. It was not a smooth path marked by signs and comfortable resting places. It was a collection of old trails, frozen valleys, narrow passages between hills, and stretches of wilderness, where even experienced travelers sometimes stopped and wondered if they had made a very questionable decision. Eric knew these lands well. He had crossed many of them during his younger years, though memory had a charming habit of making old journeys seem easier than they truly were. The mind often remembers the adventure and politely ignores the parts where a person slipped into a snowbank while carrying important belongings. Eric remembered the beauty. He remembered the struggle too. The old bard walked slowly, leaning on a wooden staff that had become almost like a second companion. The staff had no name, unlike his harp, but Eric sometimes suspected it deserved one. It had endured countless hills, countless storms, and countless moments when Eric had muttered complaints toward the sky. The sky, wisely, never answered. For several days, he traveled through forests where tall trees stood covered in frost. Their branches glittered beneath the pale northern sunlight, and the entire wilderness seemed frozen between a dream and waking. During those quiet hours, Eric often played small pieces of the unfinished song. Not the whole melody. Never the whole melody. The missing ending always stopped him. The notes would rise. The memories would return, and then the final part would disappear like a footprint covered by fresh snow. It frustrated him, not because he needed another famous song. He had already received more recognition than he ever expected. It frustrated him because the melody felt incomplete, in the same way a conversation felt incomplete when someone left before saying goodbye. The northern song had something left to say. Eric was certain of it. On the 7th day of his journey, he reached the remains of an ancient stone tower hidden among the hills. Most travelers ignored the place. There was little reason to visit. The tower had no treasure, no guards, and no great hall filled with celebrations. It was simply an old structure, slowly being reclaimed by nature. But Eric recognized it. Long ago, he had heard stories about the tower from wandering storytellers. They claimed it once belonged to King Arvid of the Northern Realms. King Arvid was remembered differently depending on who told the story. Some described him as a wise ruler who brought peace between rival clans. Others described him as a proud king who learned humility only after losing everything. And some storytellers, naturally, had created versions where he was both wise and foolish, depending on which part of the evening they were telling. That was the interesting thing about old legends. People rarely preserved the entire truth. They preserved the parts that mattered to them. Eric entered the ruined tower and searched through the old stones. The wind moved through broken walls, creating a low sound that almost resembled distant singing. He smiled. Perhaps the tower was trying to become a musician. It was not very good yet. The rhythm was slightly disappointing, but Eric respected the effort. Inside the tower, he discovered faded carvings along the walls. Many were damaged by time, but some images remained clear. A king standing among villagers, a traveler carrying a harp, people from different lands sitting together, and above them all, a symbol that Eric recognized immediately. The mark of the northern song. His heart beat faster. For years, he had searched through stories and memories. Now he had found something physical, something that had survived generations. Eric carefully studied the carvings and noticed something unusual. The images were not celebrating a great battle or a royal victory. They showed people sharing food, sharing stories, sharing music. That surprised him. Most legends about kings focused on swords and victories, but this one seemed to remember something else. A curious detail about northern kingdoms was that musicians sometimes held a unique position among communities. A skilled bard was not merely an entertainer. A bard could preserve agreements, remember family histories, and carry messages between distant groups. In some places, a song could hold the same importance as a written record. Eric understood this better than anyone. Words could be forgotten, Songs had a way of refusing to disappear. As evening approached, Eric found a small chamber beneath the tower. Inside, hidden beneath layers of dust, was an old wooden box. It was not decorated with gold. It was not protected by mysterious locks. It looked almost ordinary, which, Eric thought, was exactly how important things often appeared. The world loved hiding treasures in plain sight. He opened the box carefully. Inside was a collection of faded pages. Not many, only a few. The writing was old, but still readable. Eric's hands trembled as he recognized the first lines. They were verses from the Northern Song, not the beginning, not the middle, a forgotten section between them. The words described King Arvid's final years and the choice that changed the kingdom forever. The king had not lost his power because of an enemy. He had given it away. According to the verses, Arvid believed a kingdom was not measured by the strength of its ruler, but by the memories and hopes of its people. He had invited rival clans to share their stories and create a song together. The Northern Song was born from that gathering, but the final verse remained missing, even here, even after all these years. Eric sat quietly with the pages in his hands. For a moment, disappointment arrived. He had traveled so far. He had crossed frozen valleys and ancient forests, and still, the ending escaped him. Then he noticed something written at the bottom of the final page. A single sentence, not a verse, not a lyric, a message. The last song is not found where it was written. It is found where it is remembered. Eric read the words several times. Then he looked toward the dark northern sky. For the first time in many years, he wondered if he had been searching in the wrong direction. Perhaps the final verse had never been lost. Perhaps it had simply been waiting for someone to understand it. The road through silent valleys. Eric left the old tower the following morning with fewer answers than he had hoped for and more questions than he had expected. This was, unfortunately, a common experience when chasing ancient mysteries. People often imagined discoveries as grand moments where a hidden door opened, golden light appeared, and all confusion vanished immediately. But the truth was usually less dramatic. Most discoveries simply replaced one mystery with another, wearing a slightly different cloak. Still, Eric felt lighter. The message from the old pages stayed with him as he continued north. The last song is not found where it was written. It is found where it is remembered. He repeated the words quietly while walking. At first, they seemed impossible to understand. A song had to begin somewhere. A melody needed a first voice. A verse needed someone to create it. But perhaps that was not the entire truth. Perhaps songs belonged not only to those who created them, but also to those who carried them forward. The northern wilderness seemed to agree. As Eric traveled deeper into the mountains, he noticed small signs of forgotten lives everywhere. A broken wooden marker beside an old path, a stone wall nearly covered by moss, a circle of stones where travelers once gathered around fires. The land was full of memories. It simply did not announce them loudly. Eric had always admired that about the north. The mountains never begged people to notice them. They simply existed. A person could stand before a massive peak and feel very important for a moment, until the mountain quietly reminded them that it had been there for thousands of years and would continue standing long after their dramatic speech ended. The journey became more difficult as winter tightened its grip. The winds grew sharper. The paths became narrower. Several times, Eric had to stop and rest, listening to the silence around him. The silence in the northern valleys was different from ordinary quiet. It was not empty. It felt alive. The snow absorbed footsteps. The trees moved slowly in the wind. Somewhere far away, an unseen bird called across the valley. Eric often found himself humming old melodies during these moments. Not the famous songs people knew, The small ones, the forgotten ones, the tunes he had collected from villagers whose names history would never record. He believed those songs mattered just as much as the great legends, perhaps even more. A king might be remembered for 100 years, but a simple melody sung by a family could survive for centuries. After several more days, Eric reached a narrow valley surrounded by tall cliffs. The place was almost completely hidden from the outside world. No major road passed through it. No merchants traveled there regularly. Even experienced travelers rarely visited. The valley had a strange reputation. People said it was silent. Not peaceful. Silent. There was a difference. A peaceful place welcomed you. A silent place watched you. Eric entered carefully. The first thing he noticed was the absence of music. In every northern village he had ever visited, there was always some kind of sound. Someone singing while working, someone playing an instrument, someone telling a story near a fire. But here, there was nothing. The houses stood quietly. The people moved quietly. Even the children seemed to have learned the habit of keeping their voices low. Eric found this unusual. A village without music was like a forest without birds. Something was missing. He walked toward the center of the settlement, where an elderly man approached him. The man introduced himself as Torsten, the village keeper. "You are a traveler," Torsten said. Eric smiled. "Sometimes." The old man looked at the harp on his shoulder. "And sometimes a musician." "Sometimes." Torsten studied him. "You answer strangely." Eric laughed softly. "After enough years, you learn that people often ask questions they already answered themselves." The old man almost smiled. Almost. The valley seemed to have forgotten how. Torsten invited Eric to rest, and as they walked, Eric noticed something else unusual. There were no songs carved into wooden beams, no painted symbols, no instruments displayed inside homes. Nothing that suggested music had ever been important. When Eric asked about this, Torsten became quiet. "Long ago," he said, "this valley had many songs." Eric looked at him carefully. "What happened?" The old man looked toward the mountains. "People stopped singing." That answer sounded simple. Too simple. Eric knew better. People did not abandon songs without a reason. Songs were among the most stubborn things humans created. A person could lose possessions. A person could lose a home. A person could even lose a kingdom. But people often carried songs with them. Torsten explained that many years earlier, the valley had suffered a tragedy. Not a battle, not an invasion. Something quieter. The people had lost their connection to their own history. The older generation stopped teaching the old melodies. The younger generation stopped asking about them. Eventually, the songs disappeared. Eric listened carefully. The story felt strangely familiar. A lost melody, a forgotten memory, a final verse, hidden somewhere among people who no longer remembered what they carried. That evening, Eric sat outside his small resting room and looked across the valley. The stars appeared one by one above the mountains. He wondered if this was why the northern song had led him here, not because someone had hidden the final verse, but because someone had forgotten it. And perhaps, before he could finish the song, he needed to help others remember. The next morning, Eric would begin searching the silent valley, not for treasure, not for ancient pages, for voices, because somewhere beneath years of silence, a song was still waiting. The village without music. Eric spent his first morning in the silent valley, doing something he had done countless times throughout his life. He listened, not with his ears alone. Listening, he believed, was a skill that required patience. Anyone could hear sounds. A person could hear footsteps, voices, wind, and the crackling of a fire. But to truly listen meant noticing what was missing. And in this valley, what was missing was everywhere. There were no children singing while they worked, no farmers humming old tunes as they repaired tools, no elders quietly repeating verses from forgotten songs. The absence felt heavier than any noise. Eric walked through the village slowly, greeting people as he passed. Many looked at him with curiosity. A wandering bard. Arriving in their quiet settlement was unusual enough, but a bard carrying a harp into a place where nobody sang was perhaps even stranger. It was like bringing a fishing net to a place with no water. The people of the valley were polite, but distant. They answered questions. They offered food. They provided shelter. Yet whenever Eirik mentioned music, their expressions changed. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked away. Others simply became quiet. That told Eric more than any answer could. People did not avoid things that meant nothing to them. They avoided things that still mattered. Later that day, he met a woman named Astrid, one of the oldest residents of the valley, Yaji. Astrid had a sharp memory and the kind of personality that suggested she had spent many years correcting people who were confidently wrong. Eric respected her immediately. Those people were valuable. Every village needed someone willing to say, "No, that is not how it happened," especially when everyone else had decided a very inaccurate version was more entertaining. Astrid examined his harp. "You carry that everywhere?" "I do." "Even through storms?" "Yes." "Even across mountains?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "That seems inconvenient." Eric smiled. "It often is." Astrid looked pleased. At least he was honest. She invited him to walk through the older part of the village, where abandoned buildings stood near the edge of the valley. "These belonged to families who kept the old songs," she explained. Eric looked around carefully. "What happened to them?" Astrid took a moment before answering. "Time happened." It was a simple response, but Eric understood. Time was often blamed as if it were an enemy with a sword, but time was rarely cruel. It was simply patient. A forgotten song did not disappear in one day. It faded slowly. A child stopped learning a verse. A parent became too busy to teach it. A grandparent assumed someone else would remember. Then one day, everyone realized the song was gone. The strange thing about traditions was that they often felt permanent while they existed. People assumed they would always be there, like rivers, like mountains, like the morning sun, until suddenly, they were not. Astrid showed Eirik a small wooden building near the edge of the settlement. Inside were old objects covered with cloth, musical instruments, broken harps, small wooden flutes, drums with worn leather. Eirik gently touched one of the instruments. "These were not destroyed," he said. "No," Astrid replied. "They were hidden." "Why?" She looked away. "Because people were afraid." That answer surprised him. Afraid of music? Astrid explained that many years earlier, the valley had experienced a terrible disagreement. Two groups of families argued over the meaning of the old songs. One group believed the songs should remain exactly as they had always been. The other believed songs were meant to change with each generation. The argument grew. Old friendships broke. Families stopped gathering. Eventually, people decided the easiest solution was to stop singing altogether. Eric sighed. Humans had a remarkable ability to take something beautiful and somehow find a way to argue about it. Even music, the one thing designed to bring people together, could become a battlefield if enough stubborn people were involved. A curious detail about northern musical traditions was that many melodies were never considered truly finished. Each generation added small changes, creating new versions while preserving older ones. A song was treated less like a carved stone and more like a living tree, growing new branches while keeping its roots. Perhaps that was the lesson this valley had forgotten. Eric spent the following days speaking with villagers. He did not ask them to sing, not at first. He asked them to remember. He asked older villagers about childhood evenings. He asked what their parents used to hum. He asked which songs were heard during celebrations. Slowly, small pieces began returning. A woman remembered 3 notes from a harvest song. A man remembered a verse his father used to sing while repairing boats. An old craftsman remembered a melody played during winter gatherings. None of these were complete. But Eric knew better than anyone that songs were often rebuilt, piece by piece. A melody could survive in a single remembered phrase. A story could survive in one person's memory. On the 4th evening, something unexpected happened. A young boy approached Eric while he was tuning his harp. The child looked nervous. "My grandmother knew a song," the boy said. Eric looked up. "What kind of song?" "I don't know." The boy hesitated. "She never finished it." Eric felt a quiet excitement. "Can you remember any part?" The boy nodded. Then he began humming. Only a few notes. Very soft, almost uncertain. But Eric froze, because those notes were familiar. They belonged to the northern song, the same melody he had searched for across frozen lands, the same song that had followed him for decades. It was not written in a royal chamber. It was not hidden beneath ancient stones. It was here, in the memory of a child. Eric lowered his eyes and smiled. Perhaps the final verse was not waiting in some forgotten place. Perhaps it was waiting for someone to ask the right question. The young apprentice's question. The boy's name was Leaf, and unlike many children, Eric had met during his travels. He did not immediately ask whether the old bard knew any exciting stories about dragons, hidden treasures, or warriors who could defeat entire armies before breakfast. This was a refreshing change. Children often had a remarkable ability to turn every conversation into a competition between impossible things. A simple tale about a farmer could somehow become a story about a farmer who secretly fought 12 giants while carrying a basket of apples. Eric had learned never to interrupt such creativity. Sometimes imagination needed to stretch its legs. But Leif was different. He was curious in a quieter way. He wanted to understand. The following morning, the boy returned while Eric was sitting outside the village, repairing a loose string on his harp. Leif watched carefully. "You fix it yourself?" "I must." "Why?" "Because if I wait for someone else, I may spend the entire winter without music." The boy considered this. "That would be terrible." "It would." Leif looked at the harp. "Do you think songs can break?" Eric paused. That was not the question he expected. Most people asked how songs were created, how they were remembered, how they traveled. But this child had asked something different. "Can songs break?" Eric placed the harp beside him. "Yes," he said. "Like a string?" "Sometimes." The boy frowned. "How?" Eric looked across the valley. "Sometimes people stop carrying them." Leif was quiet. He seemed to understand more than most adults would have. Eric had discovered throughout his life that wisdom did not always arrive with age. Some people spent 80 years on the earth and learned very little. Others noticed important things while still young enough to lose a boot in the snow and somehow not notice until evening. Leif belonged to the second group. The boy began visiting every day. At first, Eric thought he simply enjoyed listening to music. Then he realized something else. Leif remembered everything, every melody, every word, every story. If an elder mentioned a forgotten song from their childhood, Leif would return the next day and ask Eric about it. "What does this part mean? Where did this verse come from? Why did people stop singing it?" The questions never ended, and Eric secretly enjoyed that. A bard's greatest companion was often someone willing to ask questions. Not because questions always had answers. Sometimes questions were valuable because they revealed what people had stopped wondering about. One afternoon, while they walked near the edge of the valley, Leif asked something that surprised Eric. "Why are you searching for the ending?" Eric looked at him. "You know about that?" The boy shrugged. "Everyone knows." "Everyone?" "My grandmother said you came here looking for the last part of the northern song." Eric smiled. News traveled quickly in small villages, sometimes too quickly. A person could sneeze near one house, and somehow 3 families would know before supper. "What do you think?" Eric asked. Leif kicked a small stone along the path. "I think you already know it." Eric stopped walking. The boy continued. "You remember the song. You just don't know that you remember." Those words stayed with Eric. It was a strange thing to hear from someone so young. But then again, the truth did not always choose the oldest person in the room. Sometimes it chose the person who had not learned which questions were considered impossible. Eric thought about his own journey. For years, he had searched for missing pages, ancient carvings, forgotten records. He had searched outward, but perhaps the final verse had always been connected to the people he met, to the memories he collected, to the voices that shaped the song. Leif asked if he could become a bard. Eirik laughed. "Why?" "Because you travel and hear stories. That is one part of it. What is the other part?" Eric looked at the young boy. "The hardest part." "What is that?" "Remembering that the stories do not belong to you." Leif looked confused. Eric continued. "A bard does not own songs. A bard carries them." The boy nodded slowly. "That sounds heavy." "It can be." "Then why do it?" Eirik smiled. "Because carrying something important is better than carrying something meaningless." The two sat quietly for a while. The valley stretched before them. Snow rested on the mountains. The wind moved through the trees. And for a brief moment, Eric felt younger. Not because his body had changed. It had not. His knees still complained. His back still reminded him of every mountain he had climbed. But something inside him felt renewed. He had spent years searching for a lost song. Now he was teaching someone else how to listen. That evening, Eric brought Leif to the old building where the forgotten instruments were kept. Together, they examined the damaged harps and wooden flutes. Leif picked up a small instrument. "Can this be fixed?" Eric studied it. "Yes." "How?" "Carefully." The boy smiled. "That is your answer for everything." "It is a useful answer. Not very exciting. Many useful things are not exciting." Eric looked at the broken instrument. A song could be repaired. A tradition could be repaired. Even a forgotten memory could return. The next morning, Eric decided they would search deeper into the valley. Leif would come with him, not because the boy was a warrior, not because he had special powers, but because he had the one thing every great storyteller needed: curiosity. And as they prepared to leave, Eric felt something he had not felt in years. Hope. The missing song was no longer just a mystery from the past. It was becoming something alive again. The ruins beneath snow. Eric and Leif left the village early beneath a pale morning sky. The valley was still quiet, but something had changed. A few days earlier, the silence had felt heavy, like a closed door that nobody dared to open. Now it felt different. Not loud, not joyful, but hopeful. A woman hummed softly while carrying water. An old craftsman tapped a rhythm against his workbench. A child sang 3 uncertain notes before quickly stopping, as if worried someone might notice. Eric noticed. He noticed everything. A lifetime of traveling had taught him that the smallest sounds often revealed the greatest changes. Leif walked beside him, carrying a small bundle of supplies and asking questions every few minutes. Sometimes important questions. Sometimes questions that seem to come from nowhere. Do you think mountains get lonely? Eric looked upward at the enormous peaks surrounding the valley. I suppose they spend a lot of time alone, but they are always surrounded by other mountains. That is true. So maybe they are like people. Eric smiled. That is a very thoughtful idea. Leif nodded proudly. Then, after a moment, he added, although mountains probably do not complain about being hungry. Eric laughed. Most likely not. They also do not need to repair boots. Another advantage. The old bard enjoyed the boy's strange observations. They reminded him that wisdom did not always come from serious faces and quiet voices. Sometimes it arrived wrapped in curiosity and followed by a completely unnecessary comment about mountain boots. Their destination was an ancient site hidden beyond the northern cliffs. Astrid had told Eric about it before they departed. Few people visited the place anymore. It was once believed to be connected to the earliest versions of the northern song. According to old stories, the first singers of the melody had gathered there long before the valley became silent. The journey took most of the day. The path became narrower as they climbed. Snow covered the ground, hiding stones and old footprints. Leif walked carefully behind Eric. Has anyone been here recently? Probably not. Why? Because most people prefer places with warm food and comfortable beds. Leif nodded. That does sound reasonable. Adventure is often praised by people who are not currently experiencing it. The boy laughed. Eric had always believed that was one of the great truths of travel. People loved hearing about difficult journeys. They were much less enthusiastic about actually walking through freezing winds with wet socks. By afternoon, they reached the ruins. The first thing Eric noticed was the silence, not the empty silence of the forgotten village. This was older, the kind of silence that belonged to places that had witnessed countless years passing. Stone structures rose from beneath the snow, broken walls, collapsed arches, carved pillars covered in frost. The ruins were not grand like royal castles. They were simpler, more humble. They felt less like a place built to impress people and more like a place built to remember them. Eric walked slowly among the stones. He touched the carvings carefully. Many were damaged, but several symbols remained visible. Again, he saw the mark of the northern song. But this time, there was something different. The carvings showed not a king, not a warrior, not a hero. They showed ordinary people, farmers, travelers, families, children, everyone standing together. Leif noticed it too. The song was for everyone. Eirik looked at him. Yes, not just kings. No. The boy smiled. Stories usually make kings seem more important. They often do. Why? Eric thought for a moment. Because kings have people who write about them. Leif looked at the stones. What about everyone else? Eric placed a hand on one of the carvings. They have people who remember them. The two continued searching. Near the center of the ruins, they discovered a staircase leading underground. The entrance was almost completely hidden by snow. Eric cleared away the frozen layers carefully. A small opening appeared. Leif looked inside. Should we go down? Eric raised an eyebrow. That depends. On what? Whether you are asking because you are curious, or because you think hidden underground places are always full of treasure. Leif considered. A little of both. Eric laughed. At least you are honest. They descended. The chamber below was surprisingly preserved. The walls were decorated with faded paintings, a gathering, a celebration, people sharing music. At the center stood a figure holding a harp. But the figure was not a king. It was a bard. Eric stepped closer. The image showed the bard surrounded by people from different lands. Underneath was a line of ancient writing. Leif looked at it. What does it say? Eric brushed away the dust. The words were difficult to read, but slowly the meaning became clear. The song survives because every voice carries a piece. Eric became still. The message echoed the one from the old tower. The final verse was not hidden in one place. It was scattered among people, among memories, among generations. Then Leif noticed something else. Behind the painting was a small stone compartment. Inside rested a wooden tablet. Eric carefully removed it. The writing was faded, but a few lines remained. Not the final verse, not yet, but another fragment. A piece of the song that had not been heard for centuries. Eric read it quietly, and as he spoke the words, something unexpected happened. Leif began humming. The boy did not know the verse. He had never seen the tablet. Yet somehow, the melody matched. Eric looked at him in disbelief. How did you know that? Leif looked confused. I don't know. The old bard stared at the tablet, then at the boy, then at the ancient ruins around them. For the first time, he wondered whether the northern song had been searching for him all along. Maybe the journey was never about finding the lost ending. Maybe it was about finding the people who still carried it. The shadow of old battles. Eric and Leif remained beneath the ruins until the light outside began to fade. The old bard studied the wooden tablet again and again, hoping that another hidden message would appear if he looked long enough. It did not. Ancient writings had a habit of being frustratingly patient. They rarely revealed everything at once. A forgotten verse would appear, then disappear into another mystery. A clue would lead somewhere, only to quietly point toward another road. It was almost as if old secrets enjoyed watching people walk in circles. Eric suspected they probably did. The tablet contained another fragment of the northern song, but it was not the ending. It described a time when the northern clans had nearly destroyed each other. The verses spoke of anger, pride, and old wounds carried from one generation to the next. Yet, beneath those memories was something unexpected. The song did not praise the battles. It remembered the people who suffered because of them. That difference mattered. Many old tales celebrated victory. They spoke of shining armor, powerful warriors, and rulers who stood proudly after defeating their enemies. But the northern song told another kind of story. It remembered the cost. The people who waited at home, the families separated by conflict, the friendships broken by old arguments, the quiet moments after battles ended, when everyone had to decide what kind of future they wanted to build. Eric had heard countless songs throughout his life. Some were beautiful, some were powerful, some were simply loud. He had learned that volume did not always mean importance. A quiet song could carry more truth than 100 trumpets. Leif sat beside him, reading the markings carefully. Why would people remember sad things? Eric looked at the boy. Because forgetting them can be dangerous. Even painful memories? Especially those. The boy thought about that. Eric understood. It was not an easy lesson. People often wanted to keep only the pleasant parts of history, the celebrations, the victories, the happy endings. But the difficult moments mattered too. They showed people what they had survived. They showed what mistakes should not be repeated. They showed the reasons behind the songs. As they climbed back to the surface, Eric carried the tablet carefully. The journey back to the valley was quieter. Not because they had nothing to say, because they had learned something worth thinking about. When they returned, the villagers gathered around. Everyone wanted to know what they found. Eric showed them the tablet. At first, the people stared silently. Some recognized the symbols, Some looked afraid. Astrid stepped forward. My grandmother told me stories about those markings. Eric looked at her. What did she say? Astrid hesitated. She said the Northern song was not created after peace arrived. What does that mean? She said the song was created because peace had not arrived. The words settled over the gathering. Eric understood. The melody was not a celebration after everything was fixed. It was a hope created when things were still broken. That was why it survived. It gave people something to hold on to. That evening, Eric gathered the villagers. Not for a performance, not for a grand announcement, for a conversation. He asked them to share what they remembered. At first, only a few spoke. An old man remembered a song his father sang. A woman remembered a verse from her childhood. Another person remembered a rhythm used during winter gatherings. Slowly, the forgotten pieces returned. The village began to rediscover itself, but not everyone welcomed this change. A man named Ragnar approached Eric after the gathering. He was one of the older villagers, and his expression showed that he carried many years of disagreement. "You should leave this alone," Ragnar said. Eric looked at him calmly. "Why?" "Because some things are forgotten for a reason." Eric had heard those words before, many times. People often confused forgetting with healing, but they were not the same. A wound hidden beneath clothing was still a wound. A story buried beneath silence was still a story. "Do you believe the songs caused suffering?" Eric asked. Ragnar looked away. "No." "Then what are you afraid of?" The man did not answer immediately. Finally, he said, "Remembering." Eric understood. The songs did not only carry happiness, they carried everything: the joy, the sorrow, the mistakes, the losses. A person could avoid pain by forgetting, but they also lost the lessons that came with it. A curious tradition among some northern communities was that certain songs were intentionally performed slowly, with pauses between verses. These pauses were not mistakes. They represented moments for listeners to reflect and remember. The silence between notes was considered part of the music itself. Eric thought that was fitting. Sometimes silence carried meaning. But silence forever? That was different. Later that night, Leif found Eric sitting outside. "You are worried." The old bard looked at him. "Am I?" "Yes," Eric smiled. "You are observant. You think the village will never sing again." Eric looked toward the dark valley. "I think people are afraid of what they will remember." Leif sat beside him. "What should they do?" Eric looked at the stars. "The same thing every person must do with old stories." "What?" "Listen." The next days would not be easy. Finding the lost song had been one challenge. Helping people accept it was another. And Eric knew something important. The final verse was not hidden beneath stone. It was hidden behind fear. The song hidden in silence. The days that followed were unlike any other part of Eric's journey. He had crossed frozen mountains. He had searched through ancient ruins. He had followed forgotten paths where even experienced travelers hesitated. Yet somehow, the hardest challenge was not found in the wilderness. It was found among people. Eric had learned long ago that the human heart could be more difficult to understand than any ancient map. A mountain showed you where it stood. A storm announced itself before arriving. But a person could carry an entire history inside them and reveal only a single sentence. The valley was beginning to change, but slowly. Some villagers started humming old melodies again. Others brought out forgotten instruments from storage. The first attempts were uncertain. A flute player missed several notes. A singer forgot half a verse. One man stopped in the middle of a song because he could not remember what came next and became so embarrassed that Eric had to remind him that even the greatest musicians in history occasionally made mistakes. The old bard himself had once performed an entire song while accidentally playing a melody that belonged to a completely different tale. The audience had been polite, very polite, which, in Eric's experience, was sometimes more frightening than criticism. A person who says, "That was interesting," with a serious expression may be showing great kindness. But despite the awkward beginnings, something important was happening. The village was remembering, not perfectly, not all at once, but enough. Leif watched these changes with excitement. He seemed amazed that something invisible could return after being gone for so long. "How can people lose a song and find it again?" he asked. Eric smiled. "Because songs are not only kept in books or instruments. Where else? In people." Leif looked thoughtful. "So a person can be like a library?" "Yes. A very small library. Usually." The boy nodded. "Some people must be very large libraries." Eric laughed. "Some people certainly believe they are." The old bard spent many evenings helping villagers reconnect fragments of the northern song. But something bothered him. The pieces were returning. The verses were returning. The melody was returning. Yet the final part was still missing. The ending. The words that had followed him for decades. One night, after everyone had gone home, Eric sat alone with his harp. The valley was quiet. But now it was a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of forgetting. The silence before something begins. He played the melody from the beginning. The notes moved through the cold air. He played the parts he had learned from the tablet. He played the pieces remembered by the villagers. Then he stopped. The missing ending remained. For a moment, frustration returned. After all this time, after everything he had discovered, the final answer still escaped him. He lowered his head. Perhaps he had misunderstood everything. Perhaps the song was never meant to be completed. Perhaps some stories were meant to remain unfinished. Then he remembered something. The message carved beneath the ancient ruins. The song survives because every voice carries a piece. Every voice, not every old record, not every ancient stone. Every voice. Eric looked across the valley. The answer had been there all along. He had been searching for a final verse as if it were an object. Something hidden, something waiting to be discovered. But maybe the ending was not something to find. Maybe it was something to create. The thought felt strange, almost impossible. For a bard who had spent his entire life preserving songs, creating a missing piece felt like changing history. But then he remembered what he had taught Leif. A bard did not own songs. A bard carried them, and carrying something meant allowing it to continue. The next morning, Eric called the villagers together, not because he had found the ending, because he had not. He explained this honestly. The people listened. Some looked disappointed. Others seemed confused. Ragnar stood near the back, watching silently. "I searched for the final verse for many years," Eric said. "I searched among ruins, writings, and old memories." He held up the wooden tablet. "These helped us remember where the song came from." Then he looked around the gathering. "But they cannot tell us where it goes next." The villagers were silent. Eirik continued, "A song that belongs to everyone cannot end with only one person." Those words changed something. An elderly woman stepped forward. "I remember a verse my mother sang." A farmer raised his hand. "I remember another." A young child whispered a melody. Then another person added a rhythm. The pieces began joining, not perfectly, not immediately, but naturally. The song grew. Eric did not lead. He listened. For the first time in years, he was not the person searching for the melody. He was one of the people helping it return. And as the voices came together, something remarkable happened. Eric realized the final verse had never been lost. It had simply been waiting for enough people to remember that it belonged to them. The old bard closed his eyes. He heard the mountains. He heard the valley. He heard the voices of countless people who had carried pieces of the song through generations. And he understood. The ending was not hidden in the past. It was being created in the present. The last journey home, after the villagers began singing together again, Eric stayed in the valley for several more weeks. He had intended to leave quickly once he found the missing pieces of the northern song. That had been the plan. Find the verses, complete the melody, return home. Simple. Of course, plans involving ancient songs and stubborn old mysteries rarely remained simple. The truth was that Eric had discovered something unexpected. He had spent years searching for the final part of a song, but he had found something much larger. He had found people who needed their own voices returned. The valley slowly changed, not dramatically, not like the sudden transformations described in grand legends, where a single speech fixes every problem and everyone immediately becomes wiser. Real change was quieter. A family began singing during meals again. A group of children learned old melodies from their grandparents. A craftsman repaired an old instrument instead of leaving it forgotten in storage. Small things, but small things often carried the greatest meaning. Eric had learned that during his travels. A kingdom was not rebuilt only through castles and victories. Sometimes it was rebuilt through a person deciding to teach a song to a child. Eventually, the day came when Eric knew he had to leave. His journey was not over. There were still places he wanted to visit, people he wanted to see. And somewhere beyond the mountains, there was a small northern village he still called home. When he announced his departure, the villagers gathered. This time, there was music. Not perfect music, not polished music, but honest music. The kind that came from people who were not trying to impress anyone. Leif stood beside Eric with a small wooden flute. "You are really leaving?" Eric nodded. "Yes." "Why?" The old bard smiled. "Because roads exist for a reason." "But you found what you were looking for." Eric looked across the valley. "Yes." "Then why continue?" Eric adjusted his cloak, because finding something does not mean your story ends. Leif considered this. "You sound like something an old storyteller would say." Eric laughed. "That may be because I am an old storyteller." The boy smiled. "Will you come back?" Eric looked toward the mountains. "I hope so." It was not a promise. He had lived long enough to understand that promises were powerful things. A person could promise to return. A person could promise to remember. A person could promise many things. But the world had its own plans. Better to offer hope than certainty. Before leaving, Eric gave Leif one of his old songbooks. The pages were worn. The cover was damaged. Several notes were faded. To anyone else, it might have looked like something ready to be discarded. But Eric knew better. "The pages are empty in some places," Leif said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because not every song has been written yet." The boy held the book carefully. "Will I become a bard?" Eric smiled. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you are willing to listen more than you speak." Leif nodded seriously. Eric knew that was a difficult lesson. Many people wanted to tell stories. Fewer wanted to hear them. The journey home took longer than Eric expected. Age had changed the way he traveled. When he was young, he measured journeys by distance, how many valleys crossed, how many villages reached, how many mountains climbed. Now he measured journeys differently, by conversations, by memories, by moments. He passed through villages he had visited decades earlier. Some places looked almost the same. Others had changed completely. A house that once belonged to a family of farmers was now a workshop. A field where children once played was now covered with trees. An old meeting place where Eric had performed his first songs had fallen into ruins. Time had touched everything, but not everything disappeared. In one village, a young musician approached him. "Are you Eric?" The old bard smiled. "I have been called that." The musician laughed. "My grandfather knew your songs." Eric looked surprised. "He did?" "Yes. He said you once played here many years ago." The bard looked around. He did not remember every village, every face, every performance. But somehow, pieces of him remained, not because he was famous, because he had shared something. That was the strange power of songs. A person could leave a place and never return, yet their voice could remain. A curious detail about northern traveling bards was that many carried walking sticks decorated with small marks representing places they had visited or important moments from their journeys. These marks were not always meant as records of achievement. Often, they were reminders of people they had met. Eric had never carved such marks into his own staff. He thought about doing so now. Then he decided against it. His memories were already crowded enough. Besides, he had discovered something important. A person did not need to carve every story into wood. Some stories were meant to be carried quietly. After many days, Eric finally saw the familiar forests surrounding his home. The same trees, the same hills, the same northern sky. He stopped for a moment and listened. The wind moved through the branches. Somewhere nearby, a bird sang. And beneath those familiar sounds, Eric thought he heard something else. A melody, not the old song, not exactly. Something new, something growing. He smiled. The northern song had found its ending. But perhaps endings were not truly endings. Perhaps they were simply the place where another story began. The night of the final performance, when Eric finally returned to his northern village, he expected to feel only relief. After so many weeks on the road, after so many nights beneath unfamiliar skies, he imagined that arriving home would bring a simple kind of peace. And it did. But it also brought something else. A feeling that something important was waiting. The village had changed since he left. Not in a dramatic way. There were no grand towers, no banners announcing the return of a legendary bard. No musicians standing at the entrance playing so loudly that even the nearby mountains probably wished they had somewhere else to be. Life continued as it always had. People worked, families gathered, the seasons moved forward. That was what Eric loved most about the place. It did not need to become extraordinary. It was already meaningful. When the villagers saw him return, they welcomed him warmly. Some had expected him to come back with treasures from ancient ruins. Others expected some incredible discovery. Eric had to disappoint them slightly. He had not returned with gold. He had not found a forgotten crown. He had not uncovered a secret chamber filled with royal gifts. He had returned with a song. And perhaps that was better. Gold could be stolen. Crowns could be broken. Songs had a habit of escaping. They moved from person to person, from one generation to another, refusing to stay locked away. In the days after his return, Eric rested. His journey had taken more from him than he wanted to admit. His body reminded him that it was no longer the body of a young traveler. His knees complained. His shoulders ached. His back had developed a relationship with discomfort that seemed far too familiar. But his spirit felt lighter than it had in years. He spent his mornings walking through the village. He spoke with old friends. He listened to familiar voices. He noticed small things he had once ignored. The sound of someone chopping wood, the laughter of children, the quiet conversations between neighbors. After traveling through distant lands, searching for a forgotten melody, he realized something. The world was filled with songs. People simply did not always recognize them. One evening, the villagers gathered and asked Eric to perform. He expected this. After all, people had been asking him to sing for most of his life. But this time felt different. They did not want to hear the songs that had made him famous. They wanted to hear the Northern song, the one he had chased for so many years, the one that had changed from a mystery into a living memory. Eric hesitated, not because he was afraid, because he understood the importance of the moment. A song could be shared casually. It could be sung while working. It could be hummed during a quiet walk. But some songs carried the weight of many lives. This was one of those songs. As the evening settled, Eric prepared his harp. The village became quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before something meaningful, not empty silence, waiting silence. The old bard looked around at the people gathered before him. He saw friends from his youth, families who had known him for decades, children who had only heard stories about his earlier journeys. And he thought about all the voices that had carried the melody before him, the forgotten villagers, the travelers, the elders, the children, the people whose names history would never record. They were all part of this moment. Eric placed his fingers on the harp strings. Then he began. The first notes were gentle. The melody moved like wind through northern forests. It carried images of mountains, rivers, long roads beneath endless skies. The villagers listened. Some recognized pieces they had heard before. Some heard new parts. That was the beauty of the song. It was familiar and unknown at the same time, like meeting an old friend who had returned after many years and discovering they had changed, yet somehow remained the same. As the verses continued, Eric reached the parts he had discovered during his journey. The words from ancient stones, the memories from the silent valley, the fragments carried by people who had nearly forgotten them. Then came the moment he had spent his entire life seeking, the ending. Except it was not a single ending. It was many voices joining together. Eric paused. He looked toward the villagers. Then he nodded. One by one, they began singing. An old farmer added a verse. A woman remembered another. A child joined with a melody learned from someone older. The song became larger than Eric. That was exactly what he had hoped it would become. A curious tradition among northern storytellers was that a bard's greatest achievement was sometimes not creating a famous song, but creating a song that no longer needed the bard. The moment a tale could survive without its original voice was considered the moment it truly belonged to the world. Eric understood that now. He was not losing the song. He was finally setting it free. When the final notes faded, nobody spoke immediately. The silence afterward was peaceful, complete. Then someone laughed softly. Someone else began crying. Another person started humming the melody again. And soon, the village was filled with voices. Eric sat quietly, holding his harp. For years, he had feared the song would remain unfinished forever. But now he understood something. A song was not incomplete because it changed. A story was not broken because new voices joined it. That was how things survived, not by staying frozen, by continuing. And on that night, beneath the northern stars, Eric finally heard the last song of the northern bard. Not because he was the last person who could sing it, but because he was the first person willing to let everyone else sing too. The melody of lost hearts. After the night of the final performance, something changed in the northern lands. Not suddenly, not with the kind of dramatic transformation that storytellers sometimes enjoy adding when they become too excited and decide that every sunrise must arrive with thunder and a mysterious prophecy. The change was quieter. A song returned, and with it, something else returned too. Memory. For many years, the people of the North had carried pieces of the past without realizing it. They had held fragments of old stories, forgotten melodies, and family traditions that seemed small and ordinary. But small things could be powerful. A single spark could begin a fire. A single note could begin a song. A single memory could open a door that had been closed for generations. After Eric's performance, the Northern Song traveled farther than it ever had before. Not because Eric forced it into the world, not because messengers carried official copies to distant kingdoms. It traveled naturally. A traveler heard it and brought it home. A merchant remembered a verse while crossing a mountain pass. A child learned it from a grandparent and later taught it to another child. The song moved the way. All lasting things moved. Through people. Eric watched this happen with quiet amazement. For most of his life, he had believed his purpose was to preserve songs. Now he realized his purpose had always been to help them continue. There was a difference. Preserving something could mean protecting it from change. Continuing something meant allowing it to grow. And songs, like forests, needed room to grow. In the months after his return, Eric received visitors from many places. Some came because they wanted to hear the legendary bard. Others came because they wanted to understand the song that had crossed so many valleys. Eric welcomed them all, but he never performed the Northern Song the same way, twice. This surprised some people. They expected a perfect version, the exact notes, the exact words, the exact rhythm. But Eric always explained that the song was alive. A river does not stop being a river because the water changes, he would say. Why should a song? Some people understood immediately. Others needed time. Humans had always struggled with change. They loved the idea of tradition, but often forgot that traditions survived because someone, at some point, allowed them to evolve. The Northern Song became different in each place it reached. In one village, people added verses about the sea. In another, they added verses about forests and hunters. In another, they created a new melody for the final part. Eric listened to these versions whenever travelers brought them. Some made him laugh, some surprised him. Some even made him wonder if certain musicians had perhaps become a little too creative. There was one version where a heroic goat was included as a symbol of courage. Eric never discovered who added that part, but he respected the confidence required to place a goat into an ancient legend and expect everyone else to accept it. Sometimes, stories took unexpected roads. One evening, Leif returned to visit Eric. The boy was no longer quite the same. He had grown taller, his voice had changed, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had begun his own journey. "I have written my first song," Leif said. Eric smiled. "Have you?" "Yes." "Is it finished?" Leif looked uncertain. "I think so." Eric nodded. "That is good. But I changed it 3 times. That is better." Leif laughed. "I thought finished meant you stopped changing it." "Many people think that." "Are they wrong?" Eric looked toward the mountains. "A song is finished when it says what it needs to say. And if what it needs to say changes, then the song changes too." Leif thought about this. "You make everything sound simple." Eric smiled. "That is because complicated things are easier to understand after many years." The boy looked at him. "Does that mean I have to become old before I understand?" "Unfortunately. That seems unfair." "It is." They both laughed. Eric enjoyed moments like this. Not because they were grand, because they were ordinary. A conversation, a shared joke. A song passed from one person to another. Those were the things that remained. A curious detail from Northern storytelling traditions was that many bards believed memories had their own sounds. A warrior's memory might sound like drums. A farmer's memory might sound like a simple melody hummed while working. A child's memory might sound like laughter mixed with a song. To storytellers, these sounds were not separate from history. They were history. Eric believed that completely. The Northern Song was powerful because it contained many voices. The voices of kings, the voices of travelers, the voices of ordinary people, the voices of those who were remembered, and those who were almost forgotten. One evening, as snow began falling gently outside his home, Eric played the melody once more. His fingers moved slowly. His hands were older now. His movements were not as quick as they once were. But the song did not become weaker. If anything, it became deeper. The years had added meaning to every note. He closed his eyes and listened. He heard the valley. He heard the mountains. He heard the voices of everyone who had carried the song forward. And he finally understood the greatest lesson hidden within the melody. A person does not leave behind a legacy by making sure their voice is the only one remembered. A person leaves behind a legacy by helping others find their own. The Northern Song had never truly belonged to Eric. It had only passed through his hands for a while. And now, like all precious things, it continued onward. The Bard's Quiet Farewell. The years moved gently after the return of the Northern Song. They did not rush. They did not announce themselves. They simply arrived one morning after another, carrying new seasons, new stories, and new memories. Eric had learned that time was much like the northern wind. You could feel it. You could notice its presence, but you could never hold it still. His hair became completely silver. His steps became slower. The journeys that once took him days now required careful planning and more frequent rests. He joked that his feet had finally decided they deserved the same attention as his harp. "They carried me for decades," he would say. "It is only fair they complain a little now." The villagers laughed whenever he said this. They knew Eric well enough to understand that humor had always been part of his wisdom. He never believed a person needed to be serious all the time to be thoughtful. Sometimes a laugh carried a lesson better than a speech. Eric spent his final years teaching, not in a grand hall, not before kings. He taught wherever people gathered. Children sat beside him and learned old melodies. Travelers stopped by and exchanged stories. Young musicians asked questions about songs, history, and the responsibility of carrying other people's memories. Eric always answered carefully. He never wanted young storytellers to believe that being a bard meant simply standing before a crowd and receiving praise. That was the easiest part. The harder part was listening, remembering, understanding. A bard's work began long before the first note was played. It began with paying attention. One winter afternoon, a group of young musicians asked Eric what his greatest achievement had been. They expected him to mention the Northern Song. They expected him to talk about the ancient ruins, the forgotten verses, or the moment when the lost melody returned. Instead, Eric thought quietly. Then he answered, "My greatest achievement was convincing people that their own voices mattered." The young musicians looked surprised. One of them asked, "Not the song?" Eric smiled. "The song was only the path." That answer stayed with them, because they eventually understood what Eric had discovered after a lifetime of wandering. Songs were never only about sound. They were about connection. They carried the memories of people who might otherwise disappear from history. A king might have his name carved into stone. A warrior might have statues built in his honor. But a farmer singing while working could leave behind something just as lasting. A feeling, a moment, a memory. Eric often thought about the people who had helped shape the Northern Song. Many of them were unknown. Their names were not written in royal records. No monuments stood in their honor, but their voices remained. That was enough. One evening, as the first snow of the season covered the village, Leif visited again. He was now a grown storyteller. He carried his own harp, his own collection of songs, his own journeys behind him. When he entered Eric's home, the old bard smiled. "You took your time," Leif laughed. "You told me roads were important. They are. I followed many. And I learned many stories. Eric nodded proudly. Good. Leif sat beside him. For a while, neither spoke. They simply listened to the wind outside. After many years, Leif understood that silence was not empty. It was another kind of music. Finally, he asked, "Do you still think about the final verse?" Eric looked toward the window. The snow fell quietly. No. Leif seemed surprised. You spent your whole life searching for it. Yes. And now you do not think about it? Eric smiled. I think about what I learned from searching for it. What is that? The old bard took a moment. Then he answered. Sometimes we spend years looking for the thing we lost, only to discover we were changed by the search itself. Leif nodded slowly. That was the kind of answer Eric had always given. Not a simple answer, a useful one. The seasons continued. Eric's performances became less frequent. His voice was softer. His hands sometimes struggled with difficult melodies. But whenever he sang, people listened. Not because he was the greatest musician in the north, not because he was a legend, because he was Eric, the man who had walked through frozen valleys searching for a forgotten song and returned with a lesson about remembering. A curious belief among some northern storytellers was that a bard's final song was not always the last song they performed. Instead, it was the final lesson they gave to others. The melody might end, but the meaning continued through those who listened. Eric believed that was true. One evening, he placed his old harp beside him and ran his hand along the wooden frame. The instrument had traveled farther than he ever imagined. It had been carried through storms, across mountains, into places where nobody expected music to survive. Now it rested quietly. Eric smiled. The harp had done its work. So had he. He looked toward the northern sky one last time and listened. The wind moved through the trees. The snow covered the ground. Somewhere far away, someone was singing. And Eric knew that was enough. Because a song that continues after its singer becomes silent has already achieved something greater than immortality. It has become part of the world. The song that never ends. Long after Eric's footsteps became fewer, the northern song continued traveling. It moved beyond the valleys where it had first been remembered. It crossed forests. It followed rivers. It reached villages where people had never heard Eric's name, but somehow knew the melody he had carried. That was the strange and wonderful thing about songs. They rarely belonged to the people who first discovered them. A song was like a path through the wilderness. One person might clear the first stones. Another might widen the trail. Another might guide travelers along it, years later. Eventually, nobody remembered who had taken the first step. They only remembered that the path existed. The same happened with the northern song. New generations learned it. New voices changed it. New memories became part of it. And every person who sang it believed they were preserving something ancient. They were right, but they were also creating something new. In the years after Eric's final days, Leif became one of the most respected storytellers of the northern lands. He traveled as Eric once had. He walked old roads. He visited distant settlements. He listened. That was the lesson he carried most carefully. Listen first, speak second. Many young storytellers wanted to create great legends immediately. They wanted tales of heroes, battles, and impossible adventures. Leif understood that those stories had their place, but he also understood something Eric had taught him. The greatest stories were not always about extraordinary people. Sometimes they were about ordinary people who carried extraordinary things. A baker who remembered an old song. A farmer who protected a family story. A child who asked the right question. A traveler who shared a melody before moving on. These people rarely appeared in royal histories, but they shaped the world just as much. One spring, many years later, Leif returned to the silent valley where he had first met Eric. It was no longer silent. The change was remarkable. The village had become known throughout the north for its music. Travelers came not for gold or trade, but to hear the songs of the valley. The old instruments had been repaired. The forgotten melodies had returned. Children who once grew up without songs now taught songs to their own children. Leif walked through the village and smiled. He remembered how quiet the place had been when he first arrived with Eirik. He remembered the fear, the hesitation, the belief that the past was something better left buried. Now he saw something different. The past was not a chain. It was a bridge. That evening, the villagers gathered and asked Leif to tell them about Eirik. He knew they had heard many versions of the story. Some were accurate. Some were probably improved by enthusiastic storytellers who enjoyed making old events slightly more dramatic. That happened often. A person could mention that Eirik once crossed a difficult mountain pass, and 50 years later, someone might claim he defeated the mountain itself in a battle of courage. Leif always found those versions amusing. Eirik would have laughed too. So Leif told the truth. He told them about the old bard's stubbornness, his patience, his terrible habit of trying to repair his own equipment even when he clearly needed help. He told them about the journey, the ruins, the forgotten valley, the people who found their voices again. And he told them about the most important lesson Eirik ever shared. The song was never meant to belong to one person. When Leif finished speaking, the villagers began singing. Not the oldest version, not the newest version, their version. And that was exactly how it should be. A curious tradition among northern communities was that when a storyteller finished an important tale, listeners sometimes added their own small details afterward. This was not seen as correcting the storyteller. It was a way of showing that the story had become part of the community. Stories were shared possessions. They grew through many hands. As the years passed, more legends appeared about Eirik. Some said his final performance could be heard across the mountains. Some said the wind carried his melodies even after he stopped playing. Some said that travelers who became lost in the northern wilderness could follow a distant song home. Leif never argued with these stories. He knew legends had their own lives. Besides, there was something comforting about imagining that a bard who spent his life helping others remember might still be guiding people somehow. Whether the stories were true did not matter as much as what they represented. Hope, connection, the belief that voices could survive. The northern song continued for generations. Some versions became shorter, some became longer. Some changed the words completely while keeping the same heart. And that was the miracle. The song did not survive because everyone protected it from change. It survived because people loved it enough to carry it forward. That was what Eirik had finally understood. A song trapped perfectly in the past was not truly alive. A song that could breathe with every new voice would never disappear. The northern lands changed. Kings rose and fell. Villages grew and vanished. Old roads became forgotten paths. New roads appeared, but the melody remained. Not because it was written in stone, not because it was guarded by powerful people, because somewhere, always, someone remembered. A child would hear a verse. An elder would teach a tune. A traveler would carry a story farther than expected. And the song would begin again, every time, forever moving, forever growing, never truly ending. The last echo of the North, the final years of Eirik's story, were never marked by a grand moment. There was no great ceremony, no final gathering of kings, no enormous crowd waiting to witness the departure of the northern bard. And perhaps that was fitting. Eirik had spent his entire life discovering that the most important moments were often quiet. A child, learning a melody, a traveler, sharing a story, a family remembering something they thought was lost. Those were the moments that shaped the world, not always the ones carved into stone, not always the ones shouted across kingdoms. As the seasons passed, fewer people who had known Eric personally remained. The old friends of his youth became memories. The roads he once walked changed. The villages he visited became different places filled with new generations. But everywhere he had traveled, something remained. A song, a story, a small piece of himself carried forward by someone else. That was enough. Eric had never wanted statues. He had never wanted his name remembered above all others. He had seen too many names carved into monuments and too many stories reduced to simple victories. The world often remembered powerful people, but Eric believed it was just as important to remember the quiet ones. The people who planted seeds, the people who taught children, the people who kept small traditions alive. Those people were the hidden threads holding history together. One evening, many years after his final performance, Eric sat beneath the northern sky with his old harp beside him. The instrument had become worn. The wood carried marks from countless journeys. Every scratch had a memory. Every faded mark had a story. He ran his hand over it slowly. He remembered the young musician who once carried it with excitement and believed every mountain hid an adventure. He remembered the traveler who crossed frozen valleys, searching for forgotten melodies. He remembered the older man who finally understood that he had not been searching for a song. He had been searching for the people who carried it. A soft wind moved through the trees. Eric closed his eyes. For a moment, he imagined all the voices that had become part of the northern song. The villagers from the silent valley, the children who learned old melodies, the travelers who carried verses across distant lands, the forgotten singers whose names were never recorded. They were all there, not as ghosts, not as shadows, as memories. And memories, Eric had learned, were powerful things. A curious belief among northern storytellers was that a person's voice could leave a mark on the world even after they were gone. Not a physical mark, like a carving in stone, but a change in the hearts of those who heard them. A kinder action, a remembered lesson, or a song passed along could be considered a person's true echo. Eric believed that completely. The next morning, the village woke beneath a peaceful sky. The snow rested softly over the fields. The trees stood quietly. The world continued, and somewhere nearby, someone was singing. Not perfectly, not exactly, as Eric once played it, but beautifully. A young voice carried the melody through the morning air. Another voice joined. Then, another. The northern song continued. Years later, people would still tell the tale of the old bard who searched the north for a missing ending. Some would say he found an ancient secret. Some would say he discovered a forgotten treasure. Some would say the mountains themselves guided his journey. But those who understood the story knew the truth. Eric's greatest discovery was not hidden beneath ruins. It was not written on ancient pages. It was not waiting in a forgotten chamber. It was found in the voices of people. The final verse was never a single line. It was every person who chose to remember, every person who chose to share, every person who chose to keep a story alive. And that was why the song never truly ended. Because somewhere beneath the northern stars, someone would always begin it again. A child would hum the first notes. An elder would recognize the melody. A traveler would carry it onward. And the old bard's voice would return, not as a sound, but as a feeling. A reminder that no story is ever completely lost when someone is willing to listen. The northern winds would continue to move across the valleys. The mountains would continue watching over the land. The rivers would continue their endless journey toward distant seas. And among all those ancient sounds, the echo of the northern bard would remain. quiet, gentle, unforgotten. Word count, 1093. Many years had passed since Eric first stepped onto the frozen road, searching for a song that seemed impossible to complete. The journey had taken him through silence, memory, loss, and discovery. But in the end, he found something far more precious than the final words of an ancient melody. He found connection. Now, as the northern night settles softly over the valleys, imagine the voices that came before and the voices that will come after. Imagine the gentle sound of a harp resting beside a warm fire, the quiet footsteps of travelers crossing old paths, and the peaceful feeling of knowing that every story shared with kindness can continue beyond the person who first told it. The mountains remain, the forests remain, the songs remain, and somewhere, someone is always listening. So let your thoughts become quiet now. Let the worries of the day drift away like snow carried by the evening wind. You do not need to chase every answer tonight. You do not need to finish every story before resting. Some things are allowed to continue gently in the background, just like an old melody carried across a sleeping land. The northern sky grows darker. The stars appear one by one. The last notes of the bard's song fade into the peaceful silence. And there, beneath the endless sky, the story rests, safe, warm, remembered.